name is Hunter Murray, and for the research study of my own design, I did a content analysis over how the Vietnam War is portrayed within American history textbooks. But before I delve into the research I conducted, it is crucial to understand how history textbooks vary in America. This brings me to my first source, Texas versus California, 2 states, 8 textbooks, 2 American stories. This article, written by the New York Times, highlights the differences in statements from the Texas and Californian editions of textbooks. These textbooks, despite being written by the same people and covering the same topics, cover vastly different concepts within select topics. An example of the differences between these 2 editions is seen within the topic of housing discrimination in American history. Whole paragraphs on redlining and restrictive deeds only appear in the California editions of textbooks, while the Texas editions have no mention of housing discrimination at all. These two editions of textbooks reveal the issue of involving politics in the teaching of American history. However, Texas is not the sole perpetrator of removal of historical concepts and thoughts. Historical distortion can be seen in all textbooks in America. As David H. Lindquist, a professor in education at Indiana University, puts it, due to the immense amount of information to cover from human history, learning becomes a mad dash through time and space. Because of this extremely fast-paced learning style, multiple parts of history become glossed over or taught in a superficial, surface-level manner, thus distorting history and preventing it from being properly learned or taught. Secondly, Western values lead to a more distorted version of our history. Gary Paget, a professor with a PhD in curriculum and instruction, conducted a study to observe and record how textbooks portray American Indians inaccurately or falsely. Paget specifically points out a scenario in which the textbooks that he examined leave out important information about American Indian culture. He states that from an indigenous perspective, women are the backbone of culture, tradition, and community life. Traditionally, women are to be respected, and their roles are vital to not only the continuation of American Indian life, but life itself. In many American Indian cultures, women enjoyed personal and sexual freedoms that were unheard of by their European counterparts. In modern times, American Indian women are still the backbones of communities and serve as cultural repositories. However, due to European ideals at the time not aligning with women empowerment, it caused them to leave out vital information on indigenous culture because it does not adhere to their commonplace Western values. This information is still missing within textbooks to this day. The next concept to review before delving into my research is how American media and literature portrayed the Vietnam War and the Vietnamese during the war. Since its start in 1955, the concept around the Vietnam War was distorted and continued to be distorted into the future. The cause of the war was instantly shrouded in mystery and misinformation, with declarations like, North Vietnam has attacked the independent nation of South Vietnam with the objective of total conquest. American freedom was threatened. In addition to these declarations, newspapers and other media used words such as brutal, aggressive, savage, and a threat when referring to the Vietnamese. These words used to describe the Vietnamese during the war are still actively being used in textbooks covering the Vietnam War today. These sources provide foundational understanding of the knowledge that surrounds this topic of research. These sources and topics led me to my research question. What is the potential impact of westernized portrayal of the Vietnam War in American history textbooks? This study is a simple content analysis that utilizes a simple word frequency tally to highlight the most common words circulating the Vietnam War topic within textbooks. This research analyzed 9 separate textbooks and tallied the words that appeared most on the pages related to the Vietnam War. The words that were tallied were then coded into categories that encompass terms of similar meaning. An example of this is words such as freedom, liberty, and independence were all grouped under the same code of freedom. The textbooks used for analysis were chosen because they were utilized in American curriculum in the last 25 years. The textbooks chosen were Modern World History by Holt McDougall, The World Since 1945 by Wayne M., America's History by Kevin J. Fernland, Societies, Networks, and Transitions by Craig A. Lockhart, Traditions and Encounters by Jerry H. Bentley, The American People by Little McDougall, The American Promise by James L. Roark, Out of Many by John MacFarger, and World History by William J. Duiker. The chapters analyzed from these textbooks were chosen from their relevance to the Vietnam War. Chapters that encompassed the war were used, but any additional information was skipped and not included in the data obtained in this study. Chapters that included the build-up to the war in Vietnam were included because it is necessary to understand the atmosphere in the US before their involvement in the Vietnam War. The first part of my results I would like to discuss is the total percentage of pages dedicated to the Vietnam War within each textbook. The textbooks are presented on the left in the purple, and the percentage of pages that cover the Vietnam War are on the right. An additional piece of information that is important to know is that the Vietnam War is the second longest war in American history and only falls behind the war in the Middle East. The Vietnam War lasted a total of 21 years. That means the Vietnam War encompasses nearly 10% of America's total history. All percentages listed are lower than 1.5% of the total pages within these textbooks, with one dedicating 0.14% of its pages to the Vietnam War. The second aspect of my research I will be discussing are 3 graphs representing the most frequently appearing words within each textbook. This graph shows the frequency data for Kevin J. Fernland's America's History. This history textbook has the highest total percentage of pages dedicated to the Vietnam War at 1.4%. In other words, 8 pages out of nearly 600 are given to Vietnam. This textbook has a high spread of terms, spanning from the battle at home with the mention of anti-war sentiments, and the war abroad with comments on anti-communism and oppression. This textbook also comments on the reasoning behind the start of the war. 3 times this textbook attributes the start of the war with the United States' desire for world peace. In contrary to the previous textbook, Jerry H. Bentley's Traditions and Encounters has a low spread of its terms. Additionally, this textbook has the lowest percentage of pages given to Vietnam at 0.14%. Out of Many by John MacFarger is unique from the other 8 textbooks because it is the only textbook to mention the prominent hippie culture that was a staple of the 1960s and 70s in America. Additionally, the hippie culture was an invaluable asset to the protests of the war in Vietnam. This textbook is also one of 3 textbooks that mention the millions of tons of bombs dropped on Vietnam during the war. This graph shows the textbook Out of Many focuses on the war and culture at home in America rather than the war in Vietnam. The history of America's culture is invaluable in the understanding of how the Vietnam War progressed. Vietnam is one of America's most controversial wars. However, as Gerald M. Starr, a man with a PhD in sociology and a former professor at the University of Pennsylvania, puts it, the ignorance surrounding the Vietnam War is a grave disservice to the men and women who sacrificed their lives during America's second longest war. There are some limitations to comment on within this study. Firstly, with the researcher. The task of finding the content to analyze and the content analysis itself was entirely performed by myself. Due to this, human error must be factored in. The next limitation is the scarcity of resources. Due to the nature of textbooks, it can be difficult to acquire them. I was forced to rely on donations from teachers and other sources to acquire textbooks of the appropriate topics and from a more recent time frame. The third limitation that I identified is the choice to only utilize American textbooks. The viewpoint that could be acquired from a look at international textbooks or textbooks utilized overseas would provide beneficial data on how America teaches their history versus how other countries teach about America. However, this limitation goes right along the second limitation because international textbooks would be quite a difficult item for myself to acquire. With this topic, it is vital to have future research done to have a true understanding on what is missing inside textbooks when it comes to the Vietnam War. There are hundreds of textbooks that cover the topic of Vietnam that could be included into this research if they were acquired. This means that there are tremendous but limited amounts of data that could be applied to this topic of research. As mentioned in the limitations, overseas textbooks could provide crucial data to fully comprehend the knowledge and data expunged from American textbooks. Additionally, a reverse study could also be done about the Vietnam War portrayed inside of Vietnamese textbooks and media. That study could deepen the understanding of the data gathered within my research. After conducting this research, it can be inferred from the data collected that American history textbooks may not accurately teach the Vietnam War. However, due to the limitations stated, especially that of a small sample size, no definitive conclusion can be drawn. It is imperative that more research be conducted on this topic for a clear and concise conclusion to be drawn. With the limited data, the conclusion that can be inferred is similar to that of Gary Paget's in his study of American textbooks' portrayal of indigenous people. The overt racism of times has improved, but the cultural genocide that has become institutionalized is still alive and well. Thank you. I am now ready for questions.
Okay, number one. How did the choices you made when designing or implementing your research method impact your research process?
The very first choice I made when designing my methods for this research was the use of only using American history textbooks. However, as I stated in the limitations and future research, overseas and international textbooks could provide such a huge amount of data that would be beneficial to this study that I did not end up incorporating.
Okay, and number two, what are the real world implications or consequences related to your findings?
One of the largest real world implications is what I said in my conclusion, which is that words from Gary Paget, the overt racism of times has improved, but cultural genocide is still alive and well. There's tons of information being deleted and expunged from American history textbooks, and that is a very real world consequence.
And finally, if you could revisit your research process, what would you do differently and why?
If I could revisit my research process, one of the things I would do differently is I would definitely go out of my way to incorporate more textbooks. I would try harder to obtain more so I could increase my sample size, so hopefully I could make a more concise conclusion.